The guest who should have moved out months ago is finally joining us for Thanksgiving, my daughter-in-law Vanessa said with a bright smile as she lifted her glass. And for a moment the entire dining room fell silent. Nobody laughed. Nobody corrected her. Nobody even looked surprised. I simply stood there holding a bowl of mashed potatoes, staring at the long oak table that had hosted more Thanksgiving dinners than I could count. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 68 years old, and that was the moment I realized something in my family had been broken long before that evening. I smiled anyway. Then I took my seat. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. Even after Robert passed away 9 months earlier, I refused to let the tradition disappear. I woke up before sunrise that morning. I basted the turkey every hour. I baked 2 pumpkin pies from scratch. I arranged fresh autumn flowers in the center of the table exactly the way Robert liked them. The house smelled of cinnamon, sage, and memories. For weeks, I had convinced myself that this dinner would feel normal. Not perfect, just normal. I wanted one evening where grief stayed quietly in the background and family came first. Ethan arrived around noon with Vanessa. My son hugged me politely. Not warmly. Politely. There was a difference. Vanessa swept into the kitchen carrying a store-bought dessert. She made sure everyone noticed. She complimented the decorations. Complimented the food. Complimented the house. Yet somehow every word felt rehearsed. Like an actress reading lines she had memorized years ago. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed small things. Ethan checked with Vanessa before answering simple questions. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Decisions about Christmas plans were discussed without anyone asking my opinion. None of it was dramatic. That was what made it hurt. Pain rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as ordinary moments. By 6 o'clock, the table was full. My granddaughter Lily sat across from me. Ethan sat beside Vanessa. The television in the family room softly played football highlights while dishes passed from hand to hand. Everything looked exactly the way Thanksgiving was supposed to look. Then Vanessa stood to make a toast. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about gratitude, family, and new beginnings. Her voice sounded warm enough to fool a stranger. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The guest who should have moved out months ago is finally joining us for Thanksgiving. A few nervous smiles appeared. A fork clinked against a plate. Ethan lowered his eyes. Vanessa laughed lightly, as though it were harmless. As though I was supposed to laugh too. I glanced toward Robert's empty chair at the end of the table. The chair nobody had touched since his funeral. The chair that suddenly seemed farther away than ever. In that moment, I understood something important. This wasn't a joke that slipped out accidentally. It was a message. And judging by the silence around that table, it was a message everyone else already understood. I smiled. I took a sip of water. And while Vanessa believed she had embarrassed me in front of the family, I quietly began paying attention to things I should have noticed months earlier. That night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the dishes stacked beside the sink. The house felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just empty. The kind of silence that settles into the walls after something important changes. Outside, a cold November wind rattled the branches of the maple tree Robert planted 20 years ago. I wrapped leftover turkey in plastic containers and placed them carefully in the refrigerator. It was a routine I had followed for decades. The difference was that this time I felt like a visitor performing someone else's tradition. Vanessa's words kept replaying in my mind. Not because they were cruel. I had heard cruel things before. It was because nobody seemed surprised. That was what lingered. Ethan had not defended me. Lily had looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. Even the relatives who exchanged nervous glances quickly moved on to another conversation. It was as if they had all heard versions of that sentiment before. As if I was the only person at the table who had not received the memo. I switched off the kitchen lights and walked through the living room. My eyes landed on a framed photograph sitting above the fireplace. Robert stood beside Ethan on the day Ethan graduated from college. They were both smiling. Proud. Hopeful. Back then, our family felt simple. We did not have much money, but we trusted one another. Robert used to tell me that families survived because people chose loyalty every day. Looking back, I wondered when that choice stopped being made. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Old habits die hard. I brewed coffee and sat at the breakfast table where Robert and I used to start every day together. The chair across from me remained empty. 9 months had passed since his funeral, Yet sometimes I still expected to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway. Instead, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. As I sipped my coffee, I began thinking about the months after Robert's passing. At first, Ethan called regularly. He checked on me, asked if I needed groceries, stopped by on weekends. Then, little by little, things changed. Calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. If I invited him over, he usually needed to check with Vanessa first. At the time, I told myself that was normal. Married people coordinate their schedules. There was nothing wrong with that. But now, small memories surfaced with new meaning. 3 months earlier, I had noticed the garage door code no longer worked. Ethan told me he had updated the security system and forgot to mention it. A few weeks later, family plans for Christmas were discussed in a group text that somehow never included me. Then there was the afternoon I stopped by their house with homemade soup and found Vanessa quickly ending a conversation when she saw me through the window. None of those moments seemed important by themselves. Together, they formed a pattern. A quiet pattern. The kind people overlook until it becomes impossible to ignore. By the time I finished my second cup of coffee, I realized something unsettling. Vanessa's comment at Thanksgiving had not been the beginning of the story. It had simply been the first time she stopped hiding what she really thought. And if that was true, then I needed to start paying attention to everything that came before it. Over the next few days, I resisted the urge to confront anyone. At my age, I had learned that answers rarely appear when people are forced into a corner. Instead, they reveal themselves when they believe nobody is watching. So I went about my routine as usual. I watered the plants in the sunroom. I attended my church book club on Tuesday morning. I picked up groceries on Wednesday and exchanged small talk with the cashier who had known me for years. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, however, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. The first thing I noticed was how often Ethan's responses sounded borrowed. Whenever I called him, his words felt rehearsed. If I mentioned visiting, he would pause before answering, as though waiting for instructions from someone standing nearby. One afternoon, I invited him over for coffee. Something simple. Something we used to do all the time. He hesitated for several seconds before explaining that he and Vanessa already had plans. I accepted the answer politely. Then, less than an hour later, I saw photographs online showing them sitting at home watching a football game. The realization stung more than I expected. Not because they declined the invitation. Because the excuse had been unnecessary. A simple no would have been easier than a lie. That same evening, I found myself opening an old photo album. It had been years since I looked through it carefully. There was Ethan at 8 years old holding a fishing rod almost taller than he was. There was Ethan at 16 smiling beside the used pickup truck Robert, and I worked overtime to help him buy. There was Ethan on his wedding day, looking proud and hopeful as he stood beside Vanessa. I studied her face in those photographs. Back then, I genuinely believed she loved being part of our family. Maybe she did. Or maybe I had only seen what I wanted to see. As I turned another page, a memory surfaced. About 6 months before Robert passed away, he mentioned something unusual during dinner. He had noticed Vanessa asking questions about family finances. Not casual questions, detailed ones. Questions about property records, insurance policies, and retirement accounts. At the time, Robert laughed it off. He said she was probably curious. I agreed. Looking back, I wished I had asked more questions. The next clue arrived unexpectedly on Friday afternoon. My granddaughter Lily called me. She sounded nervous. Not frightened, just uncertain. We talked about school, holiday shopping, and her upcoming exams. Then she grew quiet. "Grandma," she finally said, "can I ask you something?" I told her of course. She hesitated before speaking. "Are you planning to move?" The question caught me completely off guard. I asked why she would think that. Another pause followed. "I heard Mom and Dad talking a few weeks ago. They said it would probably happen soon." My grip tightened around the phone. I kept my voice calm and asked if she knew anything else. Lily quickly explained that she did not. She only remembered hearing part of a conversation before Vanessa noticed she was listening. After we hung up, I sat motionless at the kitchen table. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. For the second time in a week, I found myself staring at an empty chair and wondering how many decisions about my future had already been made without me. That evening, I pulled an old storage box from the hall closet and carried it into the living room. Dust covered the lid. Inside were decades of documents that Robert insisted on organizing himself. Insurance papers, mortgage statements, tax records, warranty folders for appliances we no longer owned. Robert believed important things should always be easy to find. As I sorted through the files, memories surfaced alongside the paperwork. I remembered the summer Ethan broke his arm riding a bicycle and Robert slept in a hospital chair for 3 nights. I remembered the second job Robert took when Ethan wanted to attend a better college. I remembered years of sacrifices that never felt like sacrifices at the time because we were building a future for our son. Families do that. Parents do that. They give without keeping score. Somewhere after midnight, I found a folder labeled estate planning. The date on the tab was less than a year old. My heart tightened. Robert had updated everything shortly before his passing. I sat quietly and began reading. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Property information, legal instructions, contact information for his attorney, Michael Turner. A familiar name. Michael had handled our family's legal matters for nearly 20 years. Tucked inside the folder was a yellow note written in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. It was not a formal document, just a personal reminder. Yet one sentence caught my attention immediately. If anything ever feels wrong, talk to Michael before making decisions. I read the line 3 times. Robert was not a dramatic man. He chose his words carefully. The next morning, I called Michael's office. His assistant recognized my voice immediately and scheduled an appointment for the following week. After hanging up, I felt something I had not felt in months. Not certainty, not relief, simply direction. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I had somewhere to start. Over the weekend, more small pieces fell into place. On Saturday afternoon, Ethan called unexpectedly. His tone sounded unusually cheerful. He asked how I was doing, asked whether I needed anything, asked if I had thought about downsizing the house. The question arrived so casually that someone else might have missed it. I did not. I answered carefully and asked why he brought it up. There was a brief silence before he explained that maintaining a large house alone could become difficult. Then he mentioned retirement communities. He spoke as though he was offering helpful advice. Yet every sentence sounded strangely familiar, almost rehearsed. When the call ended, I sat staring at my phone. 2 days earlier, Lily had mentioned hearing conversations about me moving. Now Ethan was bringing up the subject directly. The timing felt too convenient. On Sunday, I attended church and joined friends for coffee afterward. While they chatted about grandchildren and holiday shopping, I found myself watching families interact around me. Some laughed, some disagreed, some worried about one another, but there was an honesty in their relationships that suddenly felt precious. Driving home, I realized what troubled me most was not the possibility of losing a house. It was the feeling that people I loved were discussing my future without including me. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the winter sun was already sinking behind the trees. The house stood exactly where it always had, steady and familiar. Yet as I looked at it, I could not shake the feeling that someone else had already begun making plans for it. And if that was true, I intended to find out exactly who was behind those plans before they made another move. The appointment with Michael Turner was scheduled for Tuesday morning. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the reception area watching people come and go through the glass doors. Nothing about the office had changed. The same framed certificates hung on the walls. The same coffee table stood beside the waiting chairs. Yet I felt different walking into that building. Less uncertain, more observant. When Michael finally welcomed me into his office, his expression immediately softened. He spoke kindly about Robert and asked how I had been managing. After a few minutes, I told him everything. The comment at Thanksgiving, the strange conversations, Ethan suddenly encouraging me to move, Lily overhearing discussions about my future. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and remained silent for several seconds. Then he opened a file cabinet behind his desk and removed a thick folder. My heart began beating faster. He placed it on the desk between us. Robert asked me to keep these records organized and available if you ever needed them, he said carefully. Inside were copies of estate documents, property records, and correspondence from the months before Robert passed away. Most of it appeared routine until Michael showed me several notes Robert had written during meetings. One note immediately caught my attention. Robert had documented concerns that family members might pressure me into making major housing decisions while I was grieving. The words felt almost impossible to read. Not because they were shocking, because they sounded exactly like what was happening. Michael explained that Robert had been extremely protective of my future security. He wanted to ensure that any decisions involving the house would remain entirely mine. No one else had authority to make those choices. No one. As relief began settling over me, another feeling appeared alongside it. Curiosity. Why had Robert been worried enough to leave written reminders about this? What had he noticed that I had missed? Michael could not answer that question directly. However, before I left, he handed me copies of several documents and encouraged me to review them carefully at home. Driving back, I kept thinking about Robert's instincts. He had always noticed things before anyone else. Small changes, shifts in behavior, details that seemed insignificant until later. That evening, I spread the papers across my dining room table and began reading. Hours passed. Most of the information simply confirmed what Michael had explained. Then I reached a page containing property tax records. Attached to it was a handwritten note from Robert. The note itself was brief, but one sentence stood out. Pay attention to who becomes interested in the house and when. I stared at those words for a long time. Suddenly, conversations from the past year began replaying in my mind. Vanessa complimenting the neighborhood repeatedly. Vanessa asking questions about home values. Vanessa discussing future renovations that never seemed connected to her own property. Individually, each comment sounded harmless. Together, they formed something else entirely. As I sat there reviewing old memories, my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan appeared on the screen. He wanted to stop by the next afternoon. Said he needed to discuss something important. I looked around the dining room. The same room where Thanksgiving had changed everything. Slowly, I set the phone down without responding immediately. For the first time in months, I had the uncomfortable feeling that I was finally seeing the game being played around me. And if Ethan was coming over with another carefully prepared conversation, I intended to listen very closely too. Every word. The next afternoon, Ethan arrived alone. That immediately caught my attention. Usually, important conversations came with Vanessa sitting beside him, smiling politely while guiding the discussion exactly where she wanted it to go. This time, however, he stood on my front porch by himself holding a paper coffee cup and looking more tired than I had seen him in years. I invited him inside, and we sat at the kitchen table. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. The weather, football, holiday traffic. Neither of us mentioned the real reason for the visit. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat and looked down at his coffee. Mom, I have been thinking about your future. There it was. The sentence I had been expecting. I nodded but said nothing. He continued carefully. He explained that the house was large. Maintenance was expensive. Winters were becoming harder. He talked about convenience, safety, and reducing stress. The words sounded reasonable, thoughtful even. Yet the more he spoke, the more familiar the speech became. I had practically heard the same argument before. Not from Ethan. From Vanessa. Every phrase felt borrowed. Every concern felt rehearsed. When he finished, I asked a simple question. Whose idea was this? Ethan blinked. For a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. Then he smiled awkwardly and said it was something they had discussed together. Not his idea. Not her idea. Their idea. The answer told me more than he realized. I stood and refilled my coffee. From the kitchen window, I could see Robert's maple tree swaying gently in the cold afternoon breeze. Ethan kept talking behind me. He mentioned retirement communities again. Mentioned how many amenities they offered. Mentioned social activities and maintenance-free living. It all sounded very polished, almost like a brochure. When I returned to the table, I asked another question. Have you and Vanessa been talking about me moving for a while? This time, the hesitation lasted longer. Ethan looked away, just for a second, but I noticed. We have talked about it a little, he admitted. A little. The same phrase people use when they do not want to reveal how much has actually been discussed. I nodded slowly and changed the subject. To his visible relief, the conversation shifted elsewhere. We talked for another half hour before he left. As soon as the front door closed, I remained standing in the foyer replaying every moment of our discussion. Something was missing. Ethan seemed nervous. Not excited. Not confident. Nervous. Almost as if he was delivering a proposal he did not fully believe in himself. That evening, another unexpected piece of the puzzle arrived. Lily called again. Her voice sounded hesitant. She apologized for bothering me and then quietly asked whether her parents had spoken to me about moving. I told her they had. She fell silent. Then she revealed something that made my stomach tighten. A month earlier, she had overheard Vanessa discussing renovation ideas with a friend. Not renovations for their house. Renovations for mine. New flooring. Expanded kitchen space. Updated landscaping. Vanessa had spoken about the property as though she already owned it. After the call ended, I sat alone in the living room staring at the dark television screen. Outside, snowflakes had begun drifting through the night air. Inside, everything felt suddenly clear. Ethan might have convinced himself this was about helping me. Vanessa, however, seemed to be planning for something entirely different. And the more I listened, the more convinced I became that Thanksgiving had not been a careless joke. It had been a glimpse of a future she already expected to happen. Over the following week, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped arguing with reality. For months, perhaps longer, I had been searching for innocent explanations. Misunderstandings, poor communication, stress, grief. Now, I simply observed. The moment I stopped making excuses for everyone else, patterns became impossible to ignore. Vanessa suddenly became unusually attentive. She called twice during the week to check on me. She sent links to retirement communities she described as charming and worry-free. One brochure arrived in my mailbox with a handwritten note attached. Just something to consider. The message appeared friendly, thoughtful even. Yet, every gesture felt like another push in the same direction. I thanked her politely each time. That seemed to confuse her. I suspect she expected resistance. Instead, I gave her none. The less I argued, the more comfortable she became. The more comfortable she became, the more she revealed. On Thursday afternoon, I received another call from Lily. This time she sounded frustrated. She told me her parents had been discussing future plans constantly. Not vacations. Not work projects. My house. She apologized repeatedly for bringing it up, but I assured her she had done nothing wrong. Then she shared something new. During one conversation, Vanessa mentioned that once certain paperwork was completed, everything would become much easier. Paperwork. The word stayed with me long after the call ended. That evening, I sat at my dining room table reviewing the documents Michael had provided. There was no paperwork requiring my immediate attention. No pending transfers. No unfinished estate matters. Nothing. Which raised a troubling question. What paperwork was Vanessa talking about? The following day, Michael returned my call. We discussed several details regarding Robert's records. Near the end of our conversation, he casually mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. Several months earlier, someone had contacted his office asking general questions about property transfers involving surviving spouses. Michael could not disclose confidential details, but he remembered the inquiry because the caller seemed unusually interested in timelines and ownership rights. The call had not come from Ethan. My stomach tightened. Michael did not know who made the inquiry. Yet somehow, I already suspected the answer. After we ended the call, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. The living room where Ethan opened Christmas presents as a child. The kitchen where Robert and I spent countless evenings laughing over simple meals. The hallway marked with tiny pencil lines showing Ethan's height through the years. Every corner held memories. This was never just a piece of property. It was a lifetime. Standing there, I finally understood something important. Vanessa saw the house as a future asset. Ethan saw it as a practical solution. I saw it as home. Those differences mattered. Later that weekend, Ethan invited me to dinner at their house. His message sounded cheerful, almost eager. I accepted immediately, not because I wanted answers, because I had a feeling answers were about to find me on their own. As I prepared for the visit, I noticed a calmness settling over me. The fear that had followed me since Thanksgiving was fading. In its place was clarity. Whatever plans had been forming behind closed doors were getting closer to the surface. And for the first time, I was ready to let people believe I knew far less than I actually did. Saturday evening arrived with a light snowfall covering the neighborhood in white. Christmas decorations glowed from front porches, and warm yellow lights shined through living room windows up and down the street. As I drove toward Ethan and Vanessa's house, I felt strangely calm. For weeks, I had been chasing answers. Now the answers were beginning to find me. The moment I walked through their front door, I noticed a difference in Vanessa. She looked confident, not relaxed. Confident, like someone who believed an important decision had already been made. She greeted me warmly and immediately began talking about holiday plans. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted chicken. Christmas music played softly in the background. Everything looked perfect on the surface. Yet underneath that cheerful atmosphere, I sensed expectation. During dinner, the conversation drifted from one harmless topic to another. Work schedules, shopping, family traditions. Lily remained quieter than usual, though she smiled whenever our eyes met. Ethan seemed more relaxed than he had in months. Several times, I caught Vanessa studying my face as if waiting for something. Finally, halfway through dessert, she set down her fork and smiled. "Margaret, have you thought any more about simplifying things?" she asked. The table grew quiet. Ethan immediately joined in, mentioning maintenance costs and convenience. Vanessa talked about community activities and transportation services. The same arguments appeared once again. This time, however, I did something different. I nodded. Slowly, thoughtfully. Both of them noticed immediately. "Maybe you are right," I said. The reaction was subtle but impossible to miss. Vanessa's eyes brightened. Ethan looked relieved. For a brief moment, they appeared genuinely hopeful. I continued carefully. I explained that maintaining a large property alone required energy. I admitted that I had spent considerable time reviewing my options. Every word seemed to encourage them further. Vanessa became almost excited. She began discussing possibilities with remarkable detail. Nearby retirement communities, floor plans, future schedules. At one point, she even mentioned how much easier family gatherings could become once everything was settled. Once everything was settled. The phrase lingered in the room. I simply smiled and listened. After dinner, I prepared to leave. As I walked toward the front door, Vanessa followed me outside. Snowflakes drifted through the cold air under the porch light. She folded her arms and smiled warmly. "I think this is the right decision," she said. "Everyone will be happier." I thanked her politely and drove away. Instead of heading home, I drove directly to Michael Turner's office. He had agreed to meet me briefly that evening. When I arrived, he handed me a sealed envelope from a secure file. The envelope contained a letter Robert had written several months before he passed away. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the pages. The first line stopped me cold. "Margaret, if you are reading this, it means someone may be trying to convince you that your future should be decided for you. Do not let anyone rush you." I continued reading. Robert explained that he had taken steps to protect the house and my long-term security. Then came the part that changed everything. Months before his passing, he had transferred the property into a family trust designed specifically to ensure that no one could pressure me into giving up my home. The authority remained entirely mine. Every decision, every choice, every future plan. I lowered the letter and stared at the page. Suddenly, dozens of confusing moments from the past year made sense. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I understood why Robert never seemed worried. He had seen something coming long before I did, and he had made sure I would never face it alone. The week before Christmas arrived with clear skies and bitter cold mornings. By then, I had read Robert's letter so many times that I nearly knew it by heart. I kept it safely tucked inside a folder on my dining room table beside the trust documents Michael had prepared for me. For the first time in months, I no longer felt like someone waiting for her future to be decided. I knew exactly where I stood. A few days before Christmas, Ethan invited everyone to dinner. Vanessa sounded unusually cheerful when she called. There was an excitement in her voice that reminded me of someone preparing for a celebration. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. When I arrived that evening, the house was decorated beautifully. Christmas lights glowed along the staircase. A tree stood in the corner covered in silver ornaments. Family members filled the dining room, talking and laughing while holiday music played softly in the background. Vanessa seemed especially pleased with herself. Throughout the evening, she repeatedly steered conversations toward future plans, future holidays, future family gatherings, future improvements. I listened quietly. Then, halfway through dinner, she made a mistake. Smiling across the table, she said, "Once everything is settled, we can finally start making improvements to the property." The room grew still. The sentence hung in the air longer than she intended. Ethan looked at her. Lily looked at me. Several relatives exchanged brief glances. Vanessa quickly laughed and tried to move forward, but the moment had already happened. I set my fork down carefully. Then I reached into my purse and removed a sealed folder. My voice remained calm. "Actually, there is something everyone should know." The conversation stopped completely. I opened the folder and placed several documents on the table. No anger, no raised voices, just facts. I explained that I had recently met with Michael Turner and reviewed Robert's estate plans in detail. I explained that Robert had established a family trust before he passed away. Then I shared the part nobody expected. The house could not be transferred, sold, or controlled by anyone except me. Every decision belonged solely to me. Now and in the future. Silence filled the room. Ethan stared at the documents as though seeing them for the first time. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Not dramatically, just slowly. The confidence that had surrounded her for months seemed to fade all at once. I do not understand, she said quietly. I thought. Then she stopped speaking. For the first time, there was no prepared explanation. No polished response. Ethan turned toward her. You thought what? He asked. Nobody answered immediately. Across the table, Lily finally spoke. Her voice was calm but steady. Grandma never said she wanted to leave her home. Nobody even asked what she wanted. The words landed harder than any argument could have. Ethan lowered his eyes. I could see realization beginning to replace confusion. Not realization about the trust. Realization about everything that came before it. The pressure. The assumptions. The plans discussed without me. After a long silence, I folded the documents and returned them to the folder. Then I looked around the table. Robert spent his entire life protecting this family, I said. And before he left, he made sure I could choose my own future. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged the documents. The conversation eventually moved on, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Later that night, I returned home and stood beside the living room window. Snow covered the yard. The maple tree Robert planted years ago stood quietly beneath the winter sky. I thought about the letter, the trust, the months of uncertainty that had finally come to an end. Some people believe an inheritance is money or property. Robert left me something far more valuable. He left me the freedom to decide what happened next. And for the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner, I felt completely at home again.